what would you say led you to these two jobs in particular?
So I think, like most WS students, my time spent in school was often met with confusion from folks who didn't know what WS was, or straight up opposition from people close to me and super distant from me who would say, "What are you going to do with this? Like, what can you even do with this?" Just a lot of questioning. And I think that in those moments, there's this real pull to be able to pull out like a job position title and say, this is what I'm going to be. I'm going to be a capital F firefighter, or I'm going to be a capital L lawyer. It's really easy to have those sort of titles and have people sort of basically understand like what kind of job you're going to have. But for me, the beauty of women's and gender studies is that there is this inherent sort of scrappiness to it, this like need to be creative. And part of that is, at least in my experience and the way that my politics are, I really believe in like building the world that we want to live in. I think a lot of times people think that social justice movements are about just destroying things, but it's actually about building possibilities and creating what we want to see in the world. And so I think, my answer in those moments where I'm getting questioned about, what can you do with this degree, is just that I want to do something good. I want to make change. I want to improve the world around me. And I am comfortable in that sort of not knowing if I can give someone a capital, answer to what I'm going to be when I grow up. So I think what led me to these jobs, part of it, to be completely frank with you, is just when I was job searching, these jobs came up, right? And I had to learn about them. The reality is that sometimes getting a job is literally just, you have all of your prep work and part of it is up to chance, like who's hiring at the moment, right? And so in interviewing with both of these institutions, that's how I sort of learned that I wanted to work with them. And it's connected to, I think, sort of the content of the work that I've talked about. When I was interviewing for Planned Parenthood, I had an assignment where I would create some materials based on some guidelines that they gave me. And that way, the person who was interviewing me could really see who could produce the kind of content that they were hiring for. And in doing that, I was just really excited to see the sort of end result and see that I created something that I feel like would easily show up on Planned Parenthood's Instagram. And then for the Babcock Foundation, I was hesitant at first because part of my graduate studies work was being really critical of philanthropy and the idea of charity instead of mutual aid, and the sort of institutions that are built up around money and how they can actually try to maintain power and control instead of shifting it. And so I was really nervous, but after interviewing with the folks who were hiring me, I started to understand the nuances of that organization. And the mission of the Babcock Foundation is to move people and places out of poverty in the South. I am someone who is incredibly passionate about ending poverty. I also have a deep and complicated love for the South. I am so proud to be from here, and we have so much work to do. And the South is the birthplace of all of the worst aspects of our country. And so what does it mean to be from here and to understand that the views that we have of the South are often wrong and misguided, but to also acknowledge the harmful histories that make up the South? That's really important to me. And so I think all of those reasons and more sort of led me to pursuing a job with the Babcock Foundation. I think having a job after women's and gender studies can feel like a double-edged sword sometimes. On the one hand, all of the politics and the values that I hold as a person that I can bring into a workplace or can be expressed at a workplace, or that a workplace also holds, like that is the thing that keeps me going. I cannot envision myself in a job where there isn't some sort of aspect to it that has this like social justice, liberatory framework to it. Like there has to be some part of that job that truly cares about people and wants to make the conditions that people live in better. The flip side of that is that jobs are jobs. And, you know, jobs aren't necessarily your community, and jobs aren't necessarily your friend. And so, while you can have really good working relationships with folks and you can really dig deep into your career and make it part of who you are, there's also a part of it where, you know, you have to bring your own mindset to it and you have to navigate it in the way that makes sense for you. I think that holding both of those things is simultaneously, it can be really tiring sometimes to be a values-led person, because the world isn't always going to line up with your values, and that can be really hard to deal with. And on the other hand, I think once you build communities around yourself of folks who share those values, and you can find ways to bring those aspects to your work, I think that makes it all worth it.
I really like how you were talking about wanting to say when you're perhaps a younger person like McKenna, that you're going to be a capital L lawyer or capital F fireman, but you have this like concrete job that everyone knows about, everyone's familiar with. And talking about this in like inherent ingenuity in a WGS background, because that degree doesn't necessarily directly translate to a job. Like there's not necessarily this perfect straight line from one thing to the other, right? Where you have to be sort of creative with it. And I think McKenna's talked about this before, like there's so many jobs out there that you don't even know exist until you're searching.
Specifically for my Planned Parenthood job, you know, a big majority of what I do is graphic design work. I am self-taught in graphic design. I do not have any formal training in that whatsoever. I grew up in the MySpace era where that was like part of socializing for me in high school. And I started to learn how to use Photoshop in high school and like learned HTML and like did all of that for these like social reasons. And somehow like a decade or two later, like it's turned into a job, like, and I was like on yearbook committee. So like, I think that the thing that I always try to stress to like current students when I'm talking to them is that, you know, part of going to school and getting a degree, yes, absolutely, there are going to be concrete skills that you learn in the classroom. I think specifically with WGS, questioning things and being a critical thinker, like that is the top skill I think that I have learned from WGS, and it's the thing that really sustains me, and it's the thing that I think employers really appreciate. Instead of folks who are just sort of like going along with everything, people who can get in and really think deeply and offer different opinions about things is really valuable to a workplace. But I would also stress to people that like you can bring your own skills to the table as well that you don't necessarily get from having a degree. And my Planned Parenthood job is like the perfect example of that, where like a lot of my academic background is helpful for the job, right? Like knowing certain language, like understanding how to read these like really complicated political moments and figure out how to put that in really accessible and upbeat language so that our patients are excited to get their health care from Planned Parenthood. But then there's this flip side of like, I'm constantly like creating materials for this organization, and I get paid to do that, but I have not been taught how to do that. Like, that's something that I've like done in my spare time that actually translates to this. And so I also like always try to encourage students to really explore things outside of WGS that they can mix in with that degree as well. And figure out, you know, what other kinds of things that you're passionate about and see how it can translate to a job. And I think WGS in particular, in comparison to other disciplines, helps us understand that like things are constantly changing, right? Like our context is constantly shifting, and what worked 10, 20, 30 years ago when it comes to college, like the pathway of going to college and then getting a job, that's not necessarily the reality anymore. And so I think that we're finding more and more now that folks get a degree in a certain thing, and if it's not highly specialized, like if you're not going to med school or you're not going to law school, folks aren't really getting necessarily jobs in that like correlate to their degrees. I mean, many of my peers don't actually work in what they thought that their industry would be. And so I think that that makes it even more critical that you can look at your education and understand the skills that you develop and how those can translate into many different things. And in fact, I think that can feel scary at first, but I think it actually makes you more marketable, right? That you can look at that and understand, well, you know, if I'm not going to be a capital L lawyer, then like, what are the skills that I've developed from this degree? And then how can they translate to very different industries? And I think that that's possible. And it can feel even more freeing, I guess, knowing that that you don't have to stay for 10 years in something, or if you don't want to, that like you can be creative, you can reach out and you can figure out what looks right for you. And then another thing that I would just say, I always say this to students is, you know, speaking of our current context, I think a lot of people are like, why would you do women's and gender studies? That's so useless. But what we're seeing now is that given the veracity of our social movements and how effective organizers have been over the past even 5 years. And then if we look back to last summer with the Black Lives Matter movement and how that gained global recognition, right? You know, what was the outcome of that? Well, how many companies did we see putting out equity statements after that, right? And I think that a lot of times the skills that you develop in WGS, people think of as soft skills or as useless, but actually like you're particularly educated and prepared to think deeply about equity and think about how, if a company suddenly needs an equity statement, you're an expert in how to talk about equity. It's becoming clearer and clearer that companies cannot shy away from the socio-political context that they work in, even if it is a Target, right, or a Walmart. And so we need folks who know what they're talking about and have studied this and who are affected by these issues to actually speak out and make sure that companies are acting in an equitable way. I just try to stress that to students too, that something that maybe 5 years ago seemed worthless or too political is actually something that is becoming central to the way that we understand how organizations work, and what our society is demanding to see from organizations and companies to understand where their values lie. And so I think that that's a unique skill that you learn in WGS that you're not going to learn necessarily with like a computer science degree, right? Like this moment is helping, I think, we're particularly poised, and the context is ripe for a WGS background.